Women who've done time. What was women's prison like? My mom went to prison when I was a junior in high school. She was innocent, the other people had more money and our lawyer was complete shit. Long story short, she was in there for about 1.5 years. There's a lot of girls who either are, or while in there tend to be lesbian. They're literally horny all the time. I remember being 18 and visiting my mom, and a few of the younger inmates had looked over at me a couple times and had given that blow-job look with their tongue against their cheek. Another thing is cleanliness. A lot of things get missed. Inmates pretty much do most the work around the prison, and my mom knew some people in the kitchen and they had been cleaning one day and figured they would open up the meat grinder because it hadn't been cleaned for a while. As they opened it, they found about 1 million maggots inside it. Basically it hadn't been cleaned a lot longer than people thought, and the whole prison had been eating maggot meat. Not me, but an ex's older sister got 3 DUIs and the last one meant she did a few weeks in jail. She was hot, but in a trashy way. One of the first things she said she learned was how to make a prison dildo out of a toilet paper roll, saran wrap, napkins and a rubber band. She said she didn't use one, but she said it was more sexual there than she expected. She's a fine member of society now, but just had a bit of a reckless stage. Still makes me chuckle thinking about that prison dildo though. Edit, a word. Mom was a corrections officer for a long time. So she worked in a jail, not prison. She said there was a ton of drama and sex in the women's unit compared to the men's. She referred to it as working with the bitches. Lol, I miss my frickin' mom. As someone who's spent time in jail, yes, the same jail my mom worked at, I can tell you drama in the men's unit is usually at a 0 or a 10. The women's unit was probably more of a constant 6. The bitches just walked around like they were in a high school dorm, haha. I'm not a woman, and I haven't done time, but my mum did. It was before I was born, and though I never knew why she got locked up because she would never tell me, I think it was something to do with prostitution or breaking and entering. Though she was still naturally beautiful, prison had done a lot of damage to her physically. She'd had her nose broken in multiple places, so it was really crooked and busted in. She would tell me how some of the bigger women in prison would try to sexually assault her, rape, I guess, but how, in her own words, and I loved this about her, that she would take the beatings of her life before she would let them do that to her. She was only a small woman, not much over 5 feet 2 inches, and was pretty skinny. But she had the heart of a giant. So I'm sure she would have made it hell for anyone trying to take advantage of her like that. She passed away from a drink-driving accident when I was 16. She was an alcoholic, and though she defeated a lot in her life, alcohol was something she couldn't. So, woman's prison sounded like a rough place coming from her. I really miss her, and I wish I could have asked her more about it and the rest of her life before she had me. But no matter what, though she was a bit of an outcast to society, she was and will always be my hero. Love you, Mum. I taught GED prep at a county house of correction for about 6 years, about halfway through started splitting time between the men's and women's units. I agree with other posters that the drama was always at about a 6, mostly about who was writing letters to whose man on the out. It made me sad how these women were so convinced that they needed a man to take care of them and would do anything to keep one, even though it was usually their boyfriend who got them into drugs and prostitution in the first place. I really never got hit on, but the first time I was up there I tutored 3 women for about an hour, and as we were leaving the classroom one of them thanked me for working with them. Another lady said, "Close the door a minute, I'll thank you." But it was just a laugh. I did hear some stories about the night shift, but who knows. I left kind of abruptly. A high school called and offered me a job, pretty much the next day, as high schools tend to do, but I negotiated a week to transition. When I announced to my female students I was leaving, one of them just burst into tears. All in all, the women and men were just different, the men more jokey and the women more serious, interested in kids and family and such. Edit, just thought of something. The women tended to do shorter bids and crash back more quickly. I would see the same guys maybe twice in 6 years, the same women 3 or 4 times. My mom has had a couple of stints in jail/prison. I could always ask her if she'd be willing to do an AMA. She's definitely made some poor choices and served time for those choices, and she isn't shy about it, especially if it were to be in a somewhat anonymous fashion such as Reddit. Probably late to the party, but the best way I can describe it is like a boarding school full of every type of female you can imagine. I spent about 2 months at a facility with around 400 women, whose charges ranged from small petty crimes to rape and murder. Everyone had their own cliches that they kept to, but there was a lot of stupid drama. Try to think of the most troubled girls from high school, and then imagine 400 of them stuck together, in a place that is miserable, where they are isolated from their family and the rest of society. That's basically the gist of it. But like any community, there are good people and bad people, and most of the time you can find a like-minded individual to make friends with. The facility I was at had a huge library, pretty good food, and cable TV, so I considered myself lucky in that aspect. I mostly kept to myself and read a lot, and I never got into any fights, and stayed out of trouble for the most part. Drugs and contraband still got in, a lot. That always made things interesting. I met some really strange people, and saw women who committed unspeakable crimes. It opened my eyes to a lot of things I had never seen before. Overall though, my time wasn't as bad as it could have been, and I learned some things, and hopefully I will never go back. A high school ex-girlfriend of mine went to lady jail for prescription drugs. She said that all the inmates would bark at her when she walked by because she was the puppy of the pound. She got an improvised tattoo from a wood staple in a mechanical pencil, and apparently they have a lot of freedom there. We exchanged letters. I had an ex and a good friend that were both locked up, different times but in the same state. They both pretty much reported the same stuff, a lot of drugs, had people offering them prescription pills immediately upon entry, a dearth of good books, and asshole guards. The ex didn't get undergarments for the first week she was there for literally no reason other than someone forgot to give her them at some point and they didn't want to admit to it. The friend is a strict, whole life, vegan, and they wouldn't give her veggie meals, even though they're supposed to. She ended up having to eat only bread and apples the entire time she was there, lost a ton of weight and still has digestive problems to this day. Mind you, both of these women were model prisoners, scared white girls from middle-class families that made straight A's in school. Both went in for drug/alcohol issues, and they still got treated like shit. I can only imagine what it must be like for the troublemakers. Mom went to prison for 2.5 to 3 years. I got to visit her roughly 1 to 2 times per month and a call like once a week for like 2 minutes. This is as best as I can describe her experience there at Lowell Correctional Institution from what she told me during visitation. Light side, she got to read a lot, she took a class in drafting, she got in the best shape she'd been in 12 years, alcohol addiction was broken and she made a few friends. Dark side, many times I visited her and she told me that girls she knew had died or killed others. She was once locked in solitary for a while just for witnessing a brawl. Sunlight is scarce and usually treasured. She hated count, the guards would frequently screw up count and so everyone would have to stand around for a long time until the guards figured it out. That's all I can remember at the moment. I spent a Monday through Friday in jail a couple weeks ago after some troubles from earlier this year. There's not a lot I can say about my time because I spent the whole week sitting in a cell by myself trying to go back to sleep. No one to talk to and no way to leave, it was just me in a room with a slot in the door for food. I didn't ask for anything or attempt to communicate with officers because I ultimately just wanted to be as inoffensive as possible and not cause any trouble. It was freezing cold, at least to someone who had zero physical movement, and there was no way to tell time. I counted breakfast and reread again my paperwork stating how phone calls worked and when I'd get out. All in all I found it very draining. Mentally exhausting just trying to keep occupied while having zero stimulus. Jail food is not as bad as elementary school food was. The officer who released me seemed excited to have the good job that day where he's dealing with people who want to put their real clothes back on and cheat foe. There's a whole lot of prison officers, 95% good and 5% bad, reading these comments now. I'm one myself. Let me tell you, there is some shit that goes on in prison that you wouldn't believe. This type of crap is committed by the 5%. Please don't believe that every officer is corrupt, uncaring, indifferent. Last night I talked a prisoner out of a noose and his weapons with no violence from either party. Tonight when I checked up on him he asked for Panadol, Tylenol, I guess, and I didn't have any, so he threatened to kill me and rape my wife and kids. This kind of shit and worse is what we as good officers put up with daily, so please, members of the public, if we seem a bit stressed, just remember what we do to keep you safe. Prisoners, if we seem preoccupied it's because we have huge caseloads, sometimes hundreds of others, and can't spend all our time dealing with you. Technically I was in women's prison, though it was 5 days. So all I can comment on is the fact that the overcrowding thing can be real AF. The cells held 2 bunk beds each, and the entire hallway was lined with extra bunk beds because it was overfull. I was a volunteer tutor at a juvenile detention center. The boys and girls were separated. The boys were pretty well behaved and polite. The girls' program was shut down due to an incident that happened over 5 years ago. The director of the program told us he tries not to remember what shut it down, but told us the boys are much easier to handle than the girls. He looked like a man who had seen some things. I can tell you from my experience working at one that females are the most stressful inmates to deal with. They nag and bitch constantly and will get pleasure out of giving you a hard time in the most childish ways imaginable. It's even worse for the female employees. Bullshit. They're all best friends. I saw orange is the new black, liar. Working with an alternative home for juvenile delinquents, girls were more consistently catty, but the difference between how they responded to men and women staff wasn't as extreme as the boys. The boys were less catty, and while some were okay with female staff, others were extremely opposed to female authority and would act out to protest it. Their response to presence of female authority would endanger everyone, including themselves. You'd think they'd get sent back to actual juvie, or adult prison when they were old enough, but they'd stay. Non-profit alternative juvenile correctional homes have a tendency to be ridiculously corrupt, and any person sent back to juvie or wherever was a cut in money until that bed could be filled again. I spent a week in youth jail when I was 15. It wasn't too bad because majority of the girls weren't in for violent crimes. After 3 days I'd made friends with the rest of the girls, and that worked to my advantage later. About 6 months before, I'd been hanging out with the wrong crowd and I was gang-bashed by a group of 10-15-ish girls for no reason other than I had become friends with one of their boyfriends. The main instigator later ended up in the same unit as me and my friends. For the rest of my time there they proceeded to bully and antagonize this girl. I felt kind of bad considering she looked so scared and lonely, but I couldn't help but be a little bit happy she experienced a fraction of what I felt when I was attacked. One of my friends did time. She was in 2 different prisons. In one she had to work hoeing fields in a chain gang with guns pointed at her. In the other, she had prison guards bringing her Subway and she worked at the store. She said there was a baller there and it was easy. I spent 30 days in jail after drinking underage at 19 years of age, my first offense, but my mouth got my bond revoked, so I sat there until my court date. It was horrible. The girls were beyond mean and hygiene in general was lacking. Ironically, my skin got really clear BC. I had no makeup and I bathed as much as possible in there. The food was lukewarm garbage. We usually had cold grits and warm milk for breakfast, and bologna sandwiches on hard bread for lunch. I once traded a roll of toilet paper for a twin package of Dunkin' sticks. Guards snuck me Jolly Ranchers and Snickers bite-sized candies BC. They said it was BS that I was in there. Other guards had it out for me and would drag their flashlights along my cell bars to keep me up at night. It was too light, but I made a face mask out of a pad. We used newspaper as rollers for our hair to get ready for church. I wasn't in general population BC. I talked too much shit, which was good BC. I got to bathe separately from the other girls. Overall, it was hell. I was only in there for 30 days, but it felt like an eternity, and it was shocking how quickly I acclimated to jail life. I wouldn't wish jail on my worst enemy. I'm not a woman and I have never been to prison, but I have seen Orange is the New Black. Evidently, it is a really difficult place to be for about one season, and after that, it's sort of like living at a boarding school with very lax acceptance policies. I worked in one for a few months. It was honestly like a reform school. The women there seemed like children that needed help. Women are very different creatures than men. They rely a lot on relationships and they are defined by their relationships. Many of the women formed relationships with one another, whether it was sexual or romantic. Men in prison, when frustrated or sad or angry, would act out in violence. Women would cry or show their emotions in other less harmful ways. A lot of the inmates are non-violent. I had murderers clean my work area and take out my trash. It was a safe environment, but we, as staff, always had to be safe. They work for a living as well. A lot of them had a job, whether it was in the cafeteria, cleaning, gardening, etc. They could also take classes at the prison. If they didn't have their high school diploma, they were enrolled into a GED program. Some were working on their college degrees. It really wasn't anything special. Many people that worked there loved it over working at a men's prison. It's much calmer, according to them, and the inmates are a lot more respectful and genuine of the services offered to them. My cousin works as a physiotherapist on a jail in Colombia. She tells me that life in a third world jail is hell. Pretty much every inmate does or deals drugs. They would make weapons out of every object available, from toothbrushes to plastic spoons. Fights and stabbed women are pretty common, and the vast majority of guards are corrupt. Not prison, but jail for 4 months about 7 years ago. Just a huge room with a bunch of bunk beds, nasty meals and fighting over TV. Outside for 1 hour. And I didn't shit for like the first month because that toilet area is open and I can't do my business in front of other people. Lots of women, so lots of drama. Especially since they farmed out the girls from a rougher part of town to that jail a lot. Definitely won't go back. There's a women's prison in my town, and instead of there being large walls like you'd expect, there's just a very small hedge. The prison has a baseball field right next to the road, and pretty much anyone could just run away if they wanted to. It's probably so minimum security that you do more damage to yourself by leaving. You're better off finishing your sentence there, which has to be negligibly low, like a month or some such. My sister went to prison for 14 years, just got out last year. I asked her about it while we were watching Orange is the New Black. To sum it up, she said that Oiton had a lot of things correct. It felt like a college dorm, except they couldn't leave. Some COs were assholes and some were cool. College classes were offered, you learned to make everything in a microwave. Game of Thrones was popular, working in the kitchen was the best because of the extra snacks. Hooking up happened pretty frequently, and you pretty much learned where to hide from the cameras and COs for a quickie. I was in jail, not prison, for about 14 hours. The other ladies in my holding cell were all women that were arrested frequently. I knew this because as they came in, the rest were like, "Hey girl, you're back. What did they get you for this time?" You know, same shit, assaulting my old man. Also, a girl named Pinky went into labor and I almost had to deliver it because the guards didn't believe her. It came out in the hallway. If I hadn't been arrested and knew I was supposed to be there, I would have thought I was in a fucked up scared straight from hell. Sorry I laughed at this. But you are right. So many of them love it there. I would say that 90% enjoy the break away from their families. The 10% like you just did something stupid and don't ever wanna go back. My mom went to prison in New Zealand when I was a baby. I have asked her about it at length and she's always happy to tell me about it. She seemed to have a pretty okay time of it. Did a lot of arts and crafts. Every once in a while she'll walk into the room with a thing and say, "Hey, do you know where I got these slippers/bags/necklaces?" Prison.